this thing. Peace, greetings. Hey, boos. Dr. Slater Sabra here to talk with you a little bit about African Black psychology in the American context. In this section, we're going to discuss issues in conceptualizing African Black psychology. Welcome back. So we have been talking about African Black psychology. In the previous section, I talked about the reemergence or the reascension of African Black psychology. So in this unit, we're going to talk briefly about some of the challenges in conceptualizing African Black psychology. So one challenge that has occurred are Eurocentric misconceptions. I have hopefully previously discussed the challenge of African people in America struggling with conceptual incarceration. The idea of conceptual incarceration simply means that African people who have been enslaved have been trained to think with Eurocentric concepts and not inside their African mind. So the symptom of conceptual incarceration, is also something that is reflected in Black psychologists who have not taken on an African worldview framework. So there are some challenges in African psychologists who have a challenge with differentiating the cultural reality of African people from those of the European cultural reality. And this Eurocentric misconception helps us to understand and couch the terms related to the different camps of African psychological thought. All right. So there are a couple scholars that we're going to talk about who kind of looked at African Black psychology and theories of African Black psychology, and then kind of broke it down to see or to detail what concepts, how separate the different theoretical perspectives. So Maulana Karenga is one. He's a Black studies scholar who introduced some of the serious treatment of African Black psychology in a Black studies textbook. And he wrote a book, Introduction to Black Studies, and he proposed, in terms of his analysis of African Black psychology, he proposed the existence of three distinct schools of thought in African Black psychology. And these three distinct schools of thought are connected to how we deal with the Eurocentric conceptual incarceration. So let me break it down. If I can get to the thing to go forward. Karenga identified these three schools of thought: traditionalists, reformists, and radical. He will also do analysis of Banks' work that dealt with critical methods that correspond with Karenga's three schools of thought: deconstruction, construction, and reconstruction. So getting into Karenga's work, he dealt with first the traditional school of thought. In the traditional school of thought, in what he identified, Black psychology. So again, this is psychology that Black people are writing about. Therefore, it's classified as Black psychology with a theoretical perspective. In this school of thought, the traditional school of thought, is focused on criticizing European or white psychology. It follows a defensive or reactive posture. It also supports the use of Eurocentric models of the African experience. So then we were talking about the theoretical perspectives from the Eurocentric theorists, but applying it to the African experience. So it doesn't recognize the existence of a distinct African culture. It also makes no acknowledgement of worldview or cultural reality. And They also view any and all racial authorship as appropriate to studying the African experience, so long as it is not ideologically racist in its thrust. This is a very important part because this is one component that will differentiate, make sure, that will differentiate the traditional school of thought from the reformist and radical school of thought. So, for the most part, the traditional school of Black psychology are Eurocentric universalists in black skin. And this follows Banks' deconstruction approach, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. So Karenga's reformist school of Black psychology emphasizes attacking racism and utilizing Black psychology as a means of improving general psychology. And the emphasis is in what the traditionalist school of thought is using comprehensively the Eurocentric methodology in managing the racist part, making sure it's not ideologically racist. But the reformist school wants to merge the African psychology with the European psychology, but just by adding racial experiences. The reformist school of thought emphasizes the American slavery legacies and the continuing racial oppression of Black folks. And also, it focuses on trying to change racist European attitudes away from racism and towards more of an acceptance of racial integration, to the Black experience into general psychology. So this pairs well with the reconstruction, Banks's reconstruction, where we reconstruct the Eurocentric psychology into more racially, culturally sensitive and relevant models of psychology for Black folks. Then we have Karenga's radical school of Black psychology. And Karenga sees this third camp, the last camp of psychologists and psychological thinkers, as adopting an Afrocentric conceptual framework for African Black psychology, emphasizing traditional African culture and consciousness, transforming social reality through cultural, political struggle, and does not speak to European theoretical perspectives, European ideology whatsoever. And this pairs well with Banks's construction, which is a theory, construction, and research, meaning creating out of, history of African people, the constructing perspectives and theories that will help to address and to treat the psychological needs of African people. In this school, the radical school of thought, it sees the promotion of social activism for liberation. Never stick to my time. So there's some fundamental ideological differences in Banks and Karenga's approaches to African Black psychologists. We'll deal with a little bit more in the next mini lecture, but the issues separating African psychologists is that of ideological, social, philosophical basis on racial cultural determinants. What this means is that if we put a group of Black psychologists in a room, those Black psychologists will choose and be, based on Banks and Karenga's models, a part of three different groups: traditionalists, reformists, and radical. Unfortunately, the traditionalists will argue down about how it's necessary to use Eurocentric models to treat this non-unique African challenges and African perspectives. The reformists will try to still use the Eurocentric theories, add a sprinkle of African theories in attempt to address the needs of African people, whereas the radical eliminates the Eurocentric theories and only uses African-centered theory. But one critique, which we'll deal with in the next unit, is that neither of them, based on Karenga's schools of thought, which are very accurate, wonderful models, emphasize or look at African psychologists from a worldview perspective. So we're going in the next unit, I believe, break down African Black psychology in understanding the perspective as it relates to worldview. So we'll go back through these schools of thought, but then understand why the worldview perspective is extremely important. I am Dr. Nico Slater-Sarah. Peace.